Hello from Duluth. Getting ready for some snow. Got to break out the snow shovels here shortly, but in the meantime, while I'm waiting for the snow to hit, I'm going to take a few minutes to discuss something that's been on my mind, and that is the difference between compressed air hose couplers and compressed air tool couplers. As most of you are probably aware, there's really no difference other than the physical, obvious fact that a hose coupler like this has a male pipe thread on it, and a tool coupler has a female pipe thread on it. And that's pretty much the distinction. All couplers are made basically the same, except with that one distinct difference, which is a male thread versus a female thread. Other than that, internally they're identical, absolutely identical. And that's the way everybody does it. However, I'm going to point out that what makes a good hose coupler definitely does not make a good tool coupler. It can, but it depends. There's what I consider four main features of a hose coupler that are really essential to make a decent coupler for connecting a hose to a compressor. And that is, number one, that it be safe to disconnect. You don't want the hose flailing around hitting you in the face, and which has happened to me plenty of times, and blowing out your eardrums, and that's something similar happened to my left ear. I have nothing but noise in my left ear now thanks to one of these things being disconnected near me. I'm going to need a cochlear implant to try to repair the damage. So that's one of the things I really hate about these. Most couplers you can buy are in fact unsafe to disconnect, because they will not bleed out the air before the hose comes out, so it can be very loud. That's one of the reasons that I designed the Stedland Quiet Plug, to allow standard couplers to be safe to use. It screws on the end of a hose and lets the air come out quickly, but not unsafely. And I call them the Stedland Quiet Plug or Quiet Hose Fitting. Now, it's the second thing that's very important with couplers, hose couplers specifically, is that they be leak tight. And that's another one of my pet peeves, is the way these things are designed. The vast majority of coupler designs use a bad seal, make a bad seal. They're not designed right. They don't use common engineering practices for making seals, which I'm well familiar with, having done that for almost 40 years. In this case, of this particular coupler, there's an O-ring in there, which is in a groove, but the O-ring projects out, and one side of the groove is not fully contained, and the idea behind it is that the plug goes in and it pushes the corner of the plug against the rubber O-ring, which is a horrible design, but that's the way it's designed. And what that does is it means when you rotate the plug inside the coupler, which is inevitably going to happen, there's a tendency for it to abrade the rubber, and it's inevitable that'll happen. And then it'll tear the rubber, and then the rubber will start to break up, and then it'll leak. So that's not the way to make a proper seal. If they were able to, it would be better if they had a standard design, which would be the O-ring in a groove, fully contained in a groove with proper clearances, where the O-ring seals on the barrel of the plug. That's the way, say, a Prevost and a Stedland work. But just about every other brand does not work that way. Poorly designed, so they're eventually going to leak sooner rather than later. Okay, so that's another thing. And unfortunately, when you're looking for couplers, you don't really know which ones are which way, unless somebody like me tells you. Okay, so that's an issue. Number three in importance is it have a good flow. Because you don't want restrictions. You don't want a lot of pressure drop across your main hose, connector that's connecting to your main hose. You don't want 100 psi on one side and coming out and have only 70 psi, do you? 30 psi pressure drop. That wouldn't be good. So you want minimal pressure drop. This is a high flow type, so that's not a factor. Stedland quick couplers, they also have a very high flow rate. Even though they don't use these big bore high flow plugs, still have a very good flow rate. That's number three. Number four is that they be easy to connect. Some people like myself, through age and arthritis, whatever, I don't have a lot of strength in my arm and my hands, so it's hard for me to connect these things. This particular coupler is not extremely hard, but it's much harder than the Stedland, for example. Stedland is the easiest by far to connect. This generic coupler is about halfway between a a very difficult one and a steady one. Typically it will take about 25 to 28 pounds of force to connect it, let's say 125, 140 psi. So it still can be hard for somebody like me to connect. At 80 psi, it's not a problem. Other couplers like, let's see, the V-style or one of these AMT couplers, they're horrible. They're designed to contain, to work rather with a A-style, Aero style, True Flate style, and an M style, and they don't really work well on any of them. And they're extremely hard to connect because they use a proprietary large diameter seal that has to slide under pressure, and it has a lot of friction. So these things are so hard to connect, I can't even connect them most of the time. And I'm not the only one. So bad choice. If it's an AMT coupler, I wish you luck connecting it. Most high flow couplers are in fact hard to connect. The old styles like this that have been around since the 1940s, I've used them thousands and thousands of times over the years. They're easier to connect in terms of the insertion force, but then you have the need to pull the collar back and then lock them. And they're not very airtight either because they use a flat rubber seal and just use brute force and into the plug to push against the rubber seal. So not very good in that regard either. So those are the four main criteria for a hose coupler. Number one, safe to disconnect. Number two, leak tight, long-term leak tightness, which is very important. Number three, flow rate. And number four, ease of connection and disconnection. Now in terms of tool couplers, that's a different subject. The same four criteria apply for tool couplers as apply for hose couplers. However, take some of these hose couplers are very bulky, large, heavy, and that's something you don't want when you're holding it in your hand for hours at a time. So you want it to be as light as possible, and I'll get to that in my next video.